Some of you squirmed a little bit, like a couple of you, a little, it was Kaylee back there, like, yeah, I did. So, all right. And then for others, you're like thinking to yourself, really? We're talking about sex at church, in a church camp. Like, this might seem a little odd or ironic to you, and so for whatever that is, and for others of you, you might not have been paying attention at all because, well, you were too busy thinking about that to realize that when I said that we're going to be talking about that. But here's the deal: is there are lots of reasons why it's important for us to talk about sex. All right, lots of reasons why it's important for us to talk about sex. And so I'm going to lay some of those out. First thing is God himself, all right, God himself actually has a lot to say about sex. All right, the Bible says a lot about sex. And in fact, there's one book, the Song of Solomon, that when you, for a Jewish kid growing up, you were not allowed to read the Song of Solomon until you were 16 years old. All right, and 16 years old in like biblical times was like you had a job, a mortgage, and you're probably already married and had a cat. All right, so like at 16 years old, so you weren't even allowed to read it until you were in that stage of life. It was how risque the Song of Solomon is. So God has a lot to say about sex. And here's the other thing: is you are surrounded by a lot of sex. I don't mean everybody around you is having sex. That's not what I'm saying. No, all right. What I mean is, all right, everywhere you look, whether it's in stuff that you're watching, whether it's in stuff that you read, whether it's stuff that you listen to, sex is talked about every single place you go, right? Like whether it's even in commercials, like you can be watching the most random thing and you're also like, how is this commercial popping on with this? Like this is not even like the road that I was trying to go down, and it's like it's just everywhere. And so it'd be crazy for us to not talk about it because like when Pastor JD said, hey, this is what our series is going through this week, we got some like, really, you're talking about that stuff at camp? Like, yeah. And they're like, well, why? It's like, because everybody's hearing about it anyway, why not talk about it and say what God has to say about it? In fact, as you're getting older, you're probably noticing as you go back and you rewatch some of your favorite cartoons, even your favorite cartoons that you watched as a kid talk about sex all the time, right? Like, have you guys noticed that? Yeah, all of them. And so the next thing is you are likely, all right? So God has a lot to say about sex. We're surrounded by sex, in culture everywhere. All right, you are likely thinking about sex. All right, a lot. And the older and older you get, the more and more it crosses your mind, because whether it's in the form of questions, curiosity, actual desires, these are all natural part as your development, as you're growing and maturing. All right. Next, many of you are already likely talking about sex. All right. Like I mentioned before, when I was growing up, as an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, I was my friend's primary source of information. All right. We talked about this stuff all the time, and I'm sure you have friend groups around you that do as well. And so if all of these things are true, then why wouldn't we talk about this in church? Why would we not address this? All right, so today I want to make a couple things clear. First off, this is not going to be a sex education course. That's not where we're going with this. We're not talking about the mechanics of everything and all of that, all right? Today is going to be a theology course. All right, today's going to be a theology course. And what I mean by that is what the word theology means. Theology means the study of God, all right? And so since God, all right, created sex for us, the best way for us to understand sex is to start off by understanding God and his purposes and design for it. All right. And so with that in mind, kind of the bottom line, if you don't get anything else out of the message today, what I want you to understand is this: is first, sex is a big deal to God. All right. Say that with me. Sex is a big deal to God. You guys just all said sex. All right. All right. So, all right. Next, handling sex God's way should be a big deal to us. Handling sex God's way should be a big deal to us. And so before I go any further with this, I want to make a few things really clear. We're going to be diving into some stuff here, and we're going to be talking about and wrestling with this topic, but there's some things I want you to hear before we go any further than this, and that is, first, if you've made any mistakes in this area, in this field in your life, what I want you to hear above anything else is this is not a conversation about condemnation or rejection or putting down or shaming or anything like that. This is a conversation about grace. This is a conversation about realigning our hearts with God. This is a conversation about putting God first in these matters. And this is a conversation about redemption and reconciliation and restoration and a hope for a new future. All right? Keep in mind, as I say all this, as I say everything that you're about to hear, keep in mind that my record in this is not perfect, is not unblemished. It doesn't mean that because I'm giving this message, is I'm somebody who's 100% free from mistakes in this regard. All right? Hear that. Where this comes from is this comes from somebody who once had a season in his life where he lived kind of the world standards in this regard, who then morphed, came into a relationship with God, and God immediately transformed my mind and how this whole thing works, to where I had a major God shift in my life that changed the way that I handled and pursued this. All right. And so all of that being said, that as we're talking about this is coming from an area of grace. All right. That's when I came to God, God gave me a ton of grace over my past and my mistakes, but he also gave me a plan for a new and different and better future. So keep that in mind as we dive into this topic. So think about this for a second. All right. When God created Adam and Eve, all right? When God created Adam and Eve, all right, he made them a certain way that all the necessary parts were there for this to happen. All right, think about that for a second. God specifically designed us with sex in mind. And again, I'm not talking about just the mechanical details. If you're confused about that, let's talk to your parents about that. I'm sure they'd love to have that conversation with you. I'm sure they're looking forward to it. All right, so that's what we're talking about. But so when God designed us, he designed us with that in mind. And so there's actually this guy named Dennis Hollinger. Dennis Hollinger, he's the president of Gordon Cornwell Theological Seminary. All right, and so what that means is he's a really smart guy. In fact, probably a whole ton smarter than I am. All right, and so he wrote a book called The Meaning of Sex. All right, and in The Meaning of Sex, he talks about God's purposes for sex. In fact, he breaks it down and he gives 4 specific purposes. The very first one is probably pretty obvious, and that is procreation. Now remember, this guy's a lot smarter than me. He's using terms that I might not necessarily use. All right, but what he's really saying here is making babies. All right, God's first function and purpose of sex was making babies. All right, God created sex for us as a way to continue populating the world. It was so that when God created Adam and Eve, it didn't just stop there. It wasn't like, oh, cool, great job. All right, it continued to grow. Human population continued to grow. In fact, in Genesis 1:28 says this, says God blessed them, and God said to them, this right after Adam and Eve are made, he says, hey, be fruitful and multiply, all right, and subdue the earth, and fill the earth and subdue it, all right? So really quick, how do they multiply? By sex, all right? And so imagine God's given this command to Adam and Eve. He's like, hey, be fruitful and multiply, like have babies. And like, God, well, how do we do that? And God explains it to them. We're like, look at each other like, what? And so imagine that moment for a second, all right? And so God created for this purpose in mind. The next thing that God had in mind for or in the design for sex was this, and that was for the consummation of marriage. All right, once again, another really, really intelligent term here, consummation. What he's basically saying is making something official. That's what consummation means. It means making something official. So remember the verse that Pastor JD shared in session 1 yesterday from Genesis 2. It says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. The two become one flesh. See, if you remember that verse that we talked about in marriage, that this idea that the two are becoming one flesh, that they're becoming completely and totally unified. Yep, sex is that purpose of that. See, here's the thing is the marriage commitment. When in Jesus' time, when two people got married, when two people committed to each other, that sex was like the glue to that marriage. In fact, in Jesus' time, when two people came together, all right, when two people came together in marriage, that they would have their big wedding ceremony. And they would have their wedding ceremony, they would have their reception and all that stuff. But the truth was, in Jewish times, or in Jesus' time, all right, that they were not actually officially married until they had gone to their honeymoon and had sex. All right, so if they had gotten in a camel accident on their way from the reception to the honeymoon, all right, did not count, were not married, never completed the process, all right, because sex was like the seal the deal moment for that marriage, all right? And in fact, it's kind of like this. Hold on. So it's like you have these two hearts right here, all right? Doesn't matter which is which, right? You have these two hearts, and it's almost like sex. It was like this glue, all right? Got this nice little glue stick here. And it was like it cemented these marriages or these two people together. And this is how the two would become one flesh. And so that was God's purpose and design for it, was to put two people together spiritually forever. All right. And so that was God's part of his huge design. And so this is the way that as Jesus was talking about this Bible, as the rest of the authors were writing about it in the Bible, this is the lens that they are viewing sex through, that this is such an important deal, that this is how God permanently, spiritually links two people together. All right, next is sex fosters love and intimacy. Sex fosters love and intimacy. You see, God created sex to be a very intimate act. Not something that's just thrown around, not something that's just to be shared with everyone, that this is supposed to be something that is supposed to be intimate between two people who are lifelong committed to each other, because there's this vulnerability to it, there's this togetherness, and in fact, there's this, like I said, there's this spiritual bond that remains permanently. And so in fact, God designed us and wired us so specifically in this way that when a guy and girl have sex, that there's this research shows that there's this specific chemical that gets released in the body, specifically in the brain, that as they're having sex, it creates this unique psychological bond. God has specifically wired us that this creates a permanent bond between our hearts and minds when this happens in a relationship. All right, and then last but not least, God created sex for pleasure, all right? I know that's really weird to say. It might seem to you like that might be weird to say in church, but here's the thing is, when God created everything, there's some things that he created, like microorganisms and stuff like that reproduce asexually. And what that means is they reproduce just because they're standing there like, I think I'm going to be two things now. And then bam, now they're two things. And then they're like, hey, I think we're going to be four things now. And then they're like, now there's like four things. But God loved us so much that he's like, that's not fun. That's too boring. Like, what if I do this for you? Here, I got a good one for you. You're going to love this. And we're like, thanks, God. That was amazing. Great idea. As a married person, I'm like, God, you had a great idea. All right, like good job. And see, this is the way that God looks at it. And here's the crazy thing is, so many times I feel like we think like God has this anti-sex mentality. And maybe this is the way that you hear it presented in the world around you, right? Well, Christians aren't supposed to want sex, or God for some reason is against sex. God's not against sex. He's the author and creator of it. All right, that'd be like saying Henry Ford was against cars. All right, it doesn't make sense. All right, like God is the creator of it, and so therefore it is a good thing in his eyes. And so, but I think what we have to understand is where this mindset comes from. Like in God's eyes, sex must be evil or this or that. And so I want to dive into that for a second. See, because it's very, very important for us to understand that God views sex as good. I believe that God views sex as good. So where does this mindset come from that all of a sudden like sex is bad and God hates it, or at least he hates enjoyable sex for some reason? No, it's not like that at all. Honestly, this whole thinking is honestly just a straight up lie from the enemy. The lie from the enemy who wants to take something that's good away from us and try to destroy it and wreak havoc on it. Think about it this way for a second. Like, number one, let's do a summary of all of creation, the history of creation for a second. First, if God created us, he loves us deeply. He gives us a ton of great things, like sex, for example, and was even willing to die for us. All right, that's how good God is. Meanwhile, Satan, all right, who was the head of all the angels, kind of like second in command next to the Holy Trinity, was in heaven. And he decided, hey, God, I want your throne. And so he creates this uprising with a whole bunch of the angels, tries to take over, and God casts him out and basically has him kind of waiting for, eternal punishment in hell. So Satan hates God. Satan is jealous of God's authority. He wants it for himself, didn't get it. So now that he realizes he can't get it, he does everything he can do to get back at God. But God's already proven that he's way stronger than Satan ever could be. And so what happens? Satan knows that he's no match for God himself. So the best way for him to hurt God, because he can't hurt him directly, is by hurting us, by hurting God's chosen people, by hurting God's people, his most cherished, most loved, most prized possession. All right. And so here, the way Satan gets back at God is by trying to destroy the good things that God gives us and trying to cause us to hurt ourselves in the process. All right. You see, God created us to be able to enjoy and use sex, to be able to enjoy and use sex and not be used by it. See, here's the deal: is Satan cannot create. Only God can create. Think about this for a second. Only God can create. And so, in fact, in Colossians, it says, for in him, in Jesus, all things were created. All right, say it, say it, all things. You ready? All things. All things were created in Jesus, all right? Whether it's things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Jesus and for Jesus. So what does this mean? It means sex was created by Jesus, all right? All right, and so for our good. But because Satan cannot create, he cannot create new things. All he can do are twist and warp and manipulate other things that have already been created. So that's exactly what he does in this, is how can I take a good thing that God's given them and use that as a way to cause hurt and pain and separation between them and him? And so that's how Satan uses sex, is by twisting, warping, and manipulating it, and then advertising it like crazy to make it look like it's the greatest thing in the world when it's treated his way rather than God's. And here's the deal: is Satan himself is known and labeled as the father of lies. In fact, think about the verse that Pastor JD shared yesterday, where Satan goes to Eve and he's like, and he lies and kind of twists God's words. He's like, God didn't say that you would die if you ate this? Like, yeah, I'm pretty sure he said you'd die. Well, you definitely won't die. Like, look, it's totally edible, and it's like, okay. And he twists and warps God's words to trick her. And that's exactly what he does. And here's the thing: is Satan's tactics haven't really changed since the beginning of time. And the reason why is because it keeps working. So what does all this have to do with sex? Everything. Absolutely everything. And the why is because Jesus even tells us in John 10, he says, the thief, all right, Satan, comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I have come so that they may have life and have it to the fullest. All right. And what that means, that applies in our sex life as well. That Satan's purpose and plan in it is never to do something good for our benefit. It is only to steal, kill, hurt, and destroy. It's only to steal our joy, to kill our love, and to hurt our relationship with other people, and to hurt our relationship with God. And so that's exactly his plan and purpose for it. And you know why? Just simply because he wants to hurt us and because he wants to hurt God. So all of that being said, transition us into our next idea, is all because sex is a big deal to God. Sex is a big deal to God. And so think about it this way for a second. Like, think back to those 4 purposes. I mean, if they are the key for the human race continuing, all right, then it must be a big deal to God. If it's the seal the deal moment for marriage, then it's pretty important to God. If it fosters love and intimacy, 2 things I'm pretty sure God's a fan of, then it's a big deal to God. And if he made it pleasurable as kind of a sign that, I'd say that's probably a sign that God is a fan, right? But God doesn't just give us his purposes for sex. God also gives us his parameters for sex. All right, and what I mean by that is parameters are like a boundary line. Think about like a football field and like, hey, everything within these boundary lines is in the field of play. Outside these boundary lines are off limits, penalty, all that stuff. So it's kind of like that. And so now we get into that second part of that big statement, and that is handling sex God's way should be a big deal to us. And so listen for a second. Sex is powerful, and sin is so real that we have to be aware of how Satan and our own desires, our own physical desires apart from God, work. And so the better we understand that, the better we can understand God's ultimate plan and his parameters being set up for our good. Really quick, how many of you guys saw Pastor JD's son and my son playing with the bow and arrows today? All right, so that was their gift, Pastor JD's gift to his son Beckett for his birthday. And so the reason why I say that is before Pastor JD gave Beckett the bow and arrow, he said, hey, I'm about ready to give this to you. Here's some parameters for this bow and arrow, all right? This all makes sense, right? Like, hey, if you do this, you will have a lot of fun with that bow and arrow. Like I got you this bow and arrow because I want you to have fun with it. This is a great gift that I'm giving you. But, all right, and then he gives him the but. He's like, but if I see you point at anybody, if I see you doing this, if I see you doing that, I will straight up murder you. And I'm just kidding. He didn't say that. No, he said, but if you do this, it will either mean that you will lose it, all right, or what could potentially happen is he could hurt somebody so badly, either his son or my son could hurt somebody so badly. Honestly, if one of them shot somebody in the eye, they would be like, I'm never touching this thing again. All right. They could hurt themselves from ever even wanting to use it because they didn't use it the right way. And so the same goes with us and sex. And so here's some of the parameters that God sets up around sex. All right. And so I don't want to overcomplicate all this, but it boils down to these couple things. First is there is a time and a place. The time and place for sex is marriage. All right. So go back to that Genesis chapter 2 that we shared this week. And it says that this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. All right, that's part of God's ultimate design and purpose for it. And so he obviously sets parameters around it to make sure that that's how it works and how it functions. I just like how we talked about this is the seal the deal moment where essentially those two spirits are united permanently forever in the kingdom of God. And so the problem is that when relationships go there before there's the marriage structure to support that level of intimacy, what it does is it takes something that is marriage material that has a lot of pressures and other stuff wrapped around it, and it adds those pressures to something that's not yet built with the foundation to hold the weight of that pressure. All right, it's essentially like Jesus' analogy of building a house on the rock or a house on the sand. All right, this structure of not having the marriage there to support the sex life, it is not, without that structure there, it will not stand. In fact, it will crumble under the weight of the pressure. In fact, many relationships in high school and stuff like that and in college end because of this pressure. That the relationship was doing great, the relationship was going amazingly, but once this pressure got added into it, all of a sudden it became weird, it became wonky, it became unstable, and it became unbalanced because there was now this pressure that didn't have the foundation to support it. And so when this happens, remember what we talked about, how the two, like this sex was the spiritual act that bonds the two people together permanently spiritually. And the reason why is because that was what its purpose was to connect two people together forever. But when it doesn't get used that way, it's more like this. And if you notice, you'll see parts of the hearts on both of them. That once that relationship's over, there's still some stuff that's stuck there, right? There's still, and I don't mean just like, I regret that kind of baggage. Like, my heart was so attached to that person that I don't know how I'm going to move on without them kind of pain. Because what God said is that the two will become one flesh. It was never meant to be separated again after that. And so that's what this does. And Satan uses that to cause hurt and damage in our life, to make us filled with regrets. And when relationships go that far and then they end, it hurts like crazy. It hurts way more than if that relationship would have just, kind of stayed without that thrown into the mix yet. And so that adds a whole extra level of complication, and it adds a whole extra level of hurt. And here's the deal, is God didn't design us to hurt like that. God didn't design us for that pain in mind. God didn't set up sex and be like, man, I hope this causes you a lot of pain and hurt and regret. Like, no, if it's causing pain, hurt, and regret, then you know it's wrong. All right, then you know it's not part of God's ultimate plan and beautiful design. See, in fact, Hebrews 13 says marriage should be honored by all. And what it means by honored is it means held in high esteem. Like this is the apex. This is a beautiful thing. This is something that deserves like respect. And some of you have like that family member in your life, like a grandmother or somebody like that everybody honors that, and everybody honors her. You don't talk bad about grandma. Like you don't talk about, that's that same idea of having a high honor for something. And sex and marriage should be the same thing, that it should be held in such a high honor that's like, man, God gave us this beautiful, beautiful thing. I would never talk bad about this thing, and I would never do anything to hurt. I would never do anything to hurt my Grammy. I would, because I love her and I honor her so much. Now my grandpa on the other, no, just kidding. And so sex and marriage God's saying it should be honored like that, and the marriage bed kept pure. All right, and then he goes on and says, "For God will judge the adulterer and the sexually immoral." Man, and I know if you've been to come to the warehouse for very long at all, you probably notice I don't share a lot of like doom and gloom sounding verses. This would be an easy part for me just to leave that second half off. Just like just put a little dot, dot, dot. But I'd be doing a disservice to not say God holds this thing so important, that this beautiful gift so valuable, that he says like there's judgment when we misuse God's gift. All right, if Beckett or Ari were to misuse Pastor JD's gift with the bow and arrow, there will be punishment and consequences, right? There would be ramifications for that, and same for us. But keep in mind, like I mentioned at the very beginning, is that does not neglect that there's also restoration and redemption. All right, and so I know my life is living proof of that. And so now, so keep all of that in mind. So these verses paint this pretty big idea that God has some issues with what he would label as sexual immorality. All right, sexual immorality, which basically means taking something that's a gift from God and mistreating or abusing it. I love the song that we sang today, I Just Want You, that we sang during worship. Because what that song was really saying is, God, I want you above any of the gifts that you've given me. Don't get me wrong, God, I'm not rejecting your gifts. I want the gifts that you have to give me. I just want you more. I'm not coming to you for your gifts. I'm coming to you for you and accepting the gifts how you give them. All right. And so sex falls right in that category. God, I want your gifts, but I want you to be king over them. And that's what it means when we give over our sexual life to God and say, God, I want you to be in charge. And we keep in mind that Jeremiah 29:11, that God knows his plans for us, and they are good plans to prosper us and to not hurt us. All right, so what this word sexual immorality means is that all sex outside of God's parameters, they grieve God's heart. They grieve God's heart. They break his heart. Like your creator, the one that loved you, the one when you were born, and your parents like, ah, and they're like so in love with you. God loved you even more than they did. All right, and so that same God has a plan and design for you. And so anytime we take stuff outside of God's parameters, it breaks his heart, just rips it apart. Just like that, when that relationship gets broken, it does the same thing to God. And so when that happens, God's saying, haven't I proven my love to you enough? Haven't I proved that I only want what's best for you? Is my character still in question here? God's saying, when we find ourselves in disagreement with God, all right, when we find ourselves in disagreement with God, I think we just have to really just stop and think for a second. What is God's character? Does God, and I always tell people, ask themselves these three questions. When you're in disagreement with God about a relationship, when God says, hey, not this relationship, not that relationship, or just wait. Anytime you're in disagreement with God about sex and relationships and dating and all that stuff, ask yourself three questions. Does God love me? Does he want what's best for me? And does he know better than I do? All right, if you say yes to all three of those questions, you just have to drop your hands and be like, all right, God, you're in charge. I give up. It'd be crazy of me to not trust you because you do completely love me. I do know you want what's best for me. That's why you died for me. And all right, God, you probably are a little bit smarter than I am. All right, so, and when we understand that, it helps bring clarity and rest and settling in God's design. All right, next thing is God says that we should flee from sexual immorality, which leads to the question that many people ask me. I've been in student ministry for 13 plus years now, and I've been asked this question at least 5 times a year. How far is too far? All right, and maybe this is what you're like. Okay, I get it. Don't have sex, but so how close can I get to that? All right, how close can I get to that line? And so here's what Ephesians chapter 4 says. Paul writes, he says, but among you. He's talking to the church here. And the reason why he's writing this to the church is because there's a lot of Christians in the church of Ephesus that were not living this out. All right, and he says, hey, among you, all right, Christians, there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. All right, he clarifies that. He says, who should be obeying and listening to this? God's people. If you're accepting Jesus, then it means, all right, God, you're in control. You're Lord of my life. And so he's saying there should not be even a hint of sexual immorality. So here's a good way to think about it. If you were talking with your friends about something that you were planning on doing with somebody else, and one of your non-Christian friends were like, I thought you were a Christian, all right? If they're noticing that you're crossing some sort of bound that you didn't notice, all right, that's probably pretty obvious. If a non-Christian's like, I thought Christians didn't do that, they're probably right, and maybe that should be a heart check in that moment or an obedience check in that moment. Say, all right, am I really handing this area over to God? All right, and then 1 Corinthians says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. It's literally saying that we sin or that we hurt our own body by taking this outside of God's parameters. So going back to that question, how far is too far? Really, that's probably almost a poor question, because what we're really trying to say when we say that is how close can I get to the edge without falling off of it, right? But if our goal is to not even have a hint of sexual immorality or to flee from it, then I'm not sure that this is the right question. Maybe what we should be asking instead is, how far away is too far away? How can I best guard this area of my life? And so in case you're like, yeah, great, flee, hint, not a hint, like I get it, but what does that really mean? Think about it like this. If an activity has the word sex or a word or a different word for sex in it, then don't do it, all right? So if it has the word sex or a word for sex in it, then don't do it, all right? Or how about this? Don't touch or rub any part that cannot be legally shown, all right? So don't touch or touch or rub any part that cannot legally be shown in public, all right? Or don't send pics of those parts that you shouldn't be rubbing, all right? I would think that would be obvious, but yeah, this is a hard thing for a lot of people, all right? But don't. It causes a lot of pain and harm, both for yourself and somebody else. Or, and this was a big one for me growing up, watch what you talk or tease about. This is hard, all right? This is hard. Watch what you talk or tease about. I told Pastor JD last night, I wanted to be a stand-up comedian when I was growing up, all right? And it was really hard for me not to design some of those elements in this message, but I didn't, because I understand that there's a way that I honor God with my words in this area, to not be a temptation or a stumbling block to somebody else. And so in those conversations where you notice that they're going the wrong direction, redirect them to the right direction again, so you don't send yourself down a rabbit trail that will lead you to pain and regret later. All right, so all that being said, listen to me in this. All right, sex is a big deal to God, and handling sex God's way should be a big deal to us. All right, it should be a big deal to us. And so before we close this topic, I want to just pause and for us to think about for a second a couple different things. Number one, if you've made mistakes in this area, in case you didn't catch it before, understand that there is grace, there's redemption, and there is reconciliation in this area. All right, that God loves you so much that in fact, the book of Romans says that while we were still sinners, while we were still messing up, while we were still making mistakes, while we were walking away from God, Christ Jesus died for us. Jesus didn't say, hey, get your life all put back together, then come to me when you've cleaned yourself up. No, Jesus says, come to me, you who are weary, you who are burdened, and I will give you rest. I will dust you off. I will clean you up. I will erase your track record. And so that's what I want you to understand is God gives grace and rest and redemption. After I became a Christian, before I'd even read the Bible, God already started changing my heart drastically in this area. And soon after, I ended up, even though I'd made some mistakes, not all of the mistakes, but I made enough mistakes to have some regrets. I knew some of my friends that had what they'd called a purity ring that they wore. And there's a part of me that was like, I wish I could wear that. I don't feel like I'm clean enough to put on that ring because of the mistakes I'd made in my past. I feel like I'd be a misrepresentation of that. And then God kind of altered my heart on that. And he's like, what do you think I redeemed you from? What do you think I died for you for? Do you understand that when I washed you, I washed all of you, including your past, including your scars, including your mistakes. So when God did that, and I recognized, I'm like, you're right, God, you did. And so I ended up going and buying one. I threw it on, and in fact, I kept it on every single day until Danny and I got married. In fact, in our wedding, we had a very special segment in our wedding vows, or in our ceremony, where we actually took off our purity rings and exchanged them for our wedding rings. And in fact, mine was stuck on. We had to, it took a while to get off. I thought it was going to be a virgin forever, but I'm just kidding. P. Lang will come off, So, but anyway, sorry. Yeah, it's funny. So anyway, but in that moment, and granted, most of mine and Danny's family, strict atheists, don't believe in God, don't want anything to do with God. But in this moment, we got to honor God and honor our new set of choices that we had been making for our relationship from the start. It doesn't mean things weren't difficult for us. Doesn't mean temptation and struggles weren't there. But it meant was we were constantly making efforts and choices to follow God with every aspect of our relationship. And whether you've made mistakes before in the past or not, it doesn't change what you do from this point in the future. The crazy thing about the mistakes that I'd made in my past, the only people I received judgment and condemnation for those things was from the non-Christian girls I dated before I received Christ. When they had known different things about my past, they're like, I don't know if I can do this. But every single Christian girl I dated only had grace and the redemptive heart that Jesus showed me. And the reason why was those non-Christian girls had never experienced the grace and redemption of Jesus, so they didn't know how to apply it to me. And likewise, the Christian girls I did date did know how to apply it because they had already experienced Jesus' redemption too. And so understand that. And the other thing is, and I hate to even have to say this, but some of you maybe have even had areas of this life that had been hurt, or you feel like were damaged or were taken from you from somebody who didn't respect a no, or in a time where you didn't even know how to say no. And what I want you to hear about this is that was not a part of God's design. All right, that goes back to what the enemy does and how the enemy misuses and mistreats this whole area. And so what I want you to know is, I'm sorry. I'm just sorry that if you've ever experienced that, and God's sorry, and just as much as your heart broke with that, God's heart broke 10 times more because he loves you and he never wanted that experience for you in your life. And that only comes by when somebody else misuses or mistreats this area. And so all that to be said, if you have hurt like that, understand that that's not your fault. That is not your fault. And God sees you just as pure, just as clean as anybody else, whether it's somebody who's never had any mistakes in this area or somebody who's just been fully redeemed by God. God gives that same grace and redemption and washes over all those scars. And so hear that today. So no matter what it is, my challenge for you is it's not about what's happened in your past, but it's about what today you decide to do moving forward. All right, so let's pray. God, I thank you that you're just such a great God, that you love us so much that you've given us this thing called sex as a gift. God, for any of us who haven't always used this to your plan and design, Lord, I just pray for your forgiveness. I pray for your grace. I pray for your redemption over those areas. And I pray for healing for scars and hurts. And God, this isn't an easy commitment for any of us, but Lord, I pray that you help us to make commitments today, right here and now, that for the rest of our life, God, we will honor you with our sex lives. God, that before we get married, we'll honor you with the way that we don't have sex. And after we get married, God, that we'll honor you with the way that we do have great, amazing sex with our spouse, the one that you give us, the one that we love, and the God that fits into your perfect and holy design. And so, God, I pray that you help us to do that. That you help us to set sex aside as something that is sacred and beautiful. And God, help us to never worship that over you. God, help us to always make you Lord and King over our life and to appreciate and recognize the gifts that you give us and give you all the glory in them. God, we love you, and we pray that you help keep us strong in these commitments. It's in Jesus' name.